Hello, everybody. It is I, Mr. N, and it is 2 p.m., and you know what that means. That means we are back for some more Dragonology Chronicles, The Dragon's Eye. Now, you may remember when we started off this story yesterday, Beatrice and Daniel were being sent to stay for the summer with Dr. Ernest Drake, their parents' friend in London. And they went to Dr. Drake's shop, and Daniel discovered something weird in the basement. It was creating all kinds of smoke and things behind one of the doors in the basement. And Beatrice wanted him to stay upstairs in the shop, but he wasn't going to stay upstairs in the shop. And there are some mysterious individuals, one of whom carries a dragon-headed cane, things like that going on. So, that is where we are picking up today. Chapter 3. The Natural Historian. "Do you make a habit of spying through keyholes, Daniel?" asked Dr. Drake after he had introduced himself.
"No, sir," I said. "I was looking for you, and I heard shouting and a lot of banging about. I only looked through the keyhole to see what was making the commotion."
"And after you'd looked through the keyhole, you decided to open the door and have a better look, did you?"
Yes, sir," I stammered.
"Did your sister Beatrice have a look too?"
"No, sir," I said. "She waited upstairs."
"Good," said Dr. Drake. Just then the door at the end of the corridor opened, and a short man with a red face and a dark suit emerged. He took out his watch and pointed to it meaningfully. Dr. Drake leaned towards me and said, "Then you may wait upstairs, Daniel. You may look at the things in my shop, but don't touch them. And remember, not a word of what you have seen or think you have seen to anyone. Understand?"
Yes, sir," I said. When I was halfway up the stairs, I turned back to look at Dr. Drake. He put a finger to his lips and said sternly, "Not a word." "What happened?" asked Beatrice when I had arrived back at the counter. "He caught you snooping and gave you a good telling off by the sounds of it." "Nothing happened," I replied. "But he doesn't seem as nice as I thought he was going to be. I think he's going to turn out to be one of those cross people. He says we are to wait for him." Downstairs, the shouting had started again. Then I heard 2 loud bangs, as if the creature, whatever it was trying to smash the door down. "What on earth is that?" said Beatrice. I didn't speak for a moment. Dr. Drake had told me not to say anything, but Beatrice was my sister. Didn't I have a duty to warn her? I summoned up my courage and said, "Don't tell Dr. Drake I told you this, but there's something you should know. He's got a dragon down there." "A dragon, Daniel?" scoffed Beatrice in the patronizing, "I'm a year older than you" voice that I always hated. "Don't be silly. There's no such thing as dragons." "And I'm telling you it was a dragon," I said. "It had scales and claws and everything. The room was full of smoke." Beatrice thought for a moment. There were 3 more loud bangs. Then she grinned. "Ugh," she said. "I've just had a horrible idea." "Yes?" I asked. "What if Dr. Drake is a mad scientist? What if he collects lizards and birds and cuts them up and does horrible things to them?" "Like Dr. Frankenstein," I said, laughing. "Yes, but with lizards and birds," she said. "That doesn't seem very likely," I said, shuddering despite myself. "Well, excuse me, Daniel, but the idea that he has a real dragon down there doesn't seem very likely to me either." I didn't have much to say to that. Beatrice was obviously going to have to see the dragon before she believed in it, so I went back to looking round the shop. Behind the counter there were some old paintings and a couple of drawings leaning against the wall. As I flicked through them, I could see that they were mostly of dragons, as I had expected. Beatrice came and looked at them over my shoulder. "They're pastiches," she said. "What's a pastiche?" I asked. "When we were at Uncle Algernon's, Cousin Jocasta and I managed to borrow a book on the history of art. It had a lot of color plates in it. This one looks like one of those Italian painters, Leonardo da something, she said. And this one looks like a German artist who did a famous drawing of a rabbit, only this is a dragon in the same pose. And this one looks like Turner, who liked to do stormy skies. It looks like a mess, I said. But can't you see, said Beatrice. Instead of the original paintings, these ones are all copies, only they have pictures of dragons in them. Then she let out a gasp, for the next picture didn't have any dragons in it. Instead, it was a simple watercolor of a group of people standing in front of a small hill. And there, standing right next to Dr. Drake, were two people who could only have been our mother and father. I knew it, said Beatrice bitterly. He sent them away. I hate him. But then I pointed out someone else in the picture over on the other side. It was a younger version of the same man who had been watching us from the doorway of the pub that very morning. Even in the picture, there was something creepy about him. I turned the picture over and looked at the back of it to see if it said anything about where it had been painted. In faint red pencil, I could just make out the words, SASD Picnic, Silbury Hill, Somerset, June 1868. I quickly started flipping through the stack of paintings to see if there were any more like that. Then a door slammed in the corridor, and I heard the sound of someone coming up the stairs. It was the young man who I'd seen fleeing across the corridor earlier. He was carrying a brown paper bag in one hand, and in the other a jug and 2 glasses. "Hey!" he said, giving us an enormous smile. He spoke with an American accent. "Would I be having the pleasure of addressing Master Daniel and Miss Beatrice Cook?" he asked. Beatrice, who never trusts anyone until she knows something about him or her, did not smile back. "Yes, that's right," she said. "And who are you?" "You can call me Emery," he said. "Emery Cloth. Dr. Drake said you might be hungry, so I've brought you a little something to eat." He offered the paper bag to us and placed the jug down on the counter with the glasses. "We're not hungry," said Beatrice. "Well, then that's too bad," said Emery, giving me a wink. "But I'll leave these here anyway." Emery went back downstairs. I looked in the paper bag, which contained cucumber sandwiches, and looked in the jug, which contained water. "What do you mean we're not hungry?" I said. "Daniel, I don't know if we can trust Dr. Drake," she said. "I don't know if we should stay here." "Why?" I asked. "Look what happened to our parents," she said. "As far as we know, nothing has happened to them," I said. "All right," said Beatrice. "Then since our parents wrote to us about him, I'll trust him until I find out, one way or the other." And she grabbed a sandwich and began to devour it ravenously. Chapter 4. St. Leonard's Forest. Waiting for 3 hours in Dr. Drake's Dragonalia while trying not to touch anything was like being a starving man in a room full of food I was not allowed to eat. I was desperate to ask someone about the dragon I had seen, and I was in a shop full of some of the most interesting objects I'd ever come across. Finally, at 5 o'clock, the short, red-faced man who I had seen earlier came thumping up the stairs, looking even more red-faced than before, and dashed out of the shop. Then Dr. Drake emerged. As he stood before us, his eyes caught sight of the stack of paintings, and his face broke into a wide smile. "Good afternoon, Beatrice," he said, and then, turning to me, he continued, "And Daniel, I see that you've been admiring my paintings. I'm collecting them for a book. I have many artist friends who are very helpful to me at times. I'm sorry I couldn't come to meet both of you, but as you see, something important has come up, and I've had to attend to it." Beatrice glanced at me. I knew she was thinking that our parents had said more or less exactly the same thing. "But never you mind," said Dr. Drake. "I was sure that such clever children as yourselves would have no problems finding my little shop. When I sent Emery to make sure that you were safe, I asked him to watch you closely and see how you did. You both handled yourselves excellently. I don't think Daniel would have looked quite so handsome with a black eye." "Who was that other man?" I asked. "What other man?" said Drake. "There was a man standing over there," I said, gesturing out the window at the pub doorway on the other side of the street. "He had a strangely carved cane, and he looked creepy. He's in that picture along with you and our parents."
Dr. Drake looked at the picture. Although he did his best to hide it, I could see him give a slight shudder. "Ah!" he exclaimed. "Well, that is Ignatius Crook. I have not seen him for a long time. Perhaps he wanted to visit me, and changed his mind when he saw that I already had visitors."
"And what about the
I began, but Dr. Drake interrupted me. "Now, Daniel," he said, "since you are both coming to stay with me in St. Leonard's Forest, and I am to find lovely things for you to do, we had better set off right away. We have a long journey ahead of us tonight." Many hours later, I awoke with a jolt when the carriage hit a small pothole. The rain that had been falling all day in London had given way to a clear, moonlit sky in Sussex, and I could see that we were passing through a dense forest full of many different kinds of trees. "Nearly there!" cried Dr. Drake cheerfully, pointing out the window to the pale circle of light cast by the dull beam of the carriage's lanterns. "Can you see them?" I moved over to the window and peered out with great interest. I had fallen asleep thinking about dragons and dragon-hunting expeditions, and deciding that I couldn't really see how they could be mythological at all. Was Dr. Drake actually pointing out a dragon to me now? As I peered out of the window, I spotted several small shapes moving, or rather hopping and scampering, along the road before us, and in the grass verge that ran along the side. The carriage veered slightly to avoid one of them, and suddenly I realized what they were. "Rabbits!" I said. There were hundreds of them. "Indeed," said Dr. Drake. "St. Leonard's Forest is home to one of the largest warrens in England. They make quite a mess of my garden, as you will see, but in the forest I always feel that it is I who am the interloper, so I do little about it. But we are arriving at my home. Welcome to Castle Drake." As the carriage turned off the main road and began going down a long drive, I saw that we had reached a rather ramshackle old house, surrounded by an old crumbling wall and a number of outbuildings. I could see what Dr. Drake meant about the rabbits. His lawn was quite pockmarked. Several rabbits hopped away among the trees as we stepped, yawning sleepily, from the carriage. The coachman brought down our luggage. "Many thanks," said Dr. Drake. "If you follow the road round and take the first lane on the left, you will find the inn I spoke about. The landlord will be expecting you." "What's the name of the inn?" asked the coachman. "Why," said Dr. Drake with a grin, "it's called the Dragon." And so saying, he turned, drew out a large key, and unlocked his front door. Once inside, he lit a candle for each of us and led us upstairs, where he showed us into 2 rooms that lay at the end of a long corridor. My own room, which seemed quite a little dormitory, had 4 beds in it, but I did not see how many were in Beatrice's. "It is lucky that I am in the habit of keeping rooms for strangers," said Dr. Drake, "although I do not think we will be strangers for long. Good night." And with that, he left us. I put down my small suitcase and sat down on one end of the beds. I thought about the strange experience I had had in Dr. Drake's shop. I also realized that, whoever he was, Dr. Drake was certainly not one of those adults who are cross all the time. Chapter 5. Castle Drake. My first night at Castle Drake was a restless one. I dreamt that I rode in a carriage, driven, I supposed in my dream, by Dr. Drake. It hurtled down dark, starlit lanes through an inky black forest where dragons lurked. Whenever I went to look outside to see if I could find out what had happened to Beatrice, a large, leathery creature with piercing eyes and sharp claws bashed into the carriage windows with such force that I was sure they were going to break. When I woke, I got up at once, dressed hurriedly, and went downstairs into the hall. I was disappointed that the house showed no signs of belonging to the owner of the magnificent Dr. Drake's Dragonalia. It seemed like a very ordinary house indeed. Smells of bacon led me to the kitchen, where I was surprised to find Beatrice already tucking in to a large breakfast. A short lady in a brown dress and spectacles was bending over to stir some mushrooms on the stove. The woman smiled when she saw me. "Bonjour," she said. "I am Dr. Drake's housekeeper. My name is Mademoiselle Gamay. I am pleased to meet you. I hope you slept well." I glanced over at Beatrice.
I didn't think that either of us had slept particularly well, but I looked at Mademoiselle Gamay and said, "Very well, thank you." "S'il vous plaît, sit down and have a cup of tea and some breakfast," said Mademoiselle Gamay. "It is doctor's orders, you know." And so I sat down. But as soon as Mademoiselle Gamay had put a cup of tea and a plate of food in front of me, she looked at me over the top of her spectacles, laughed, and said, "Do you know, your sister told me she slept well too. You will be the first children I have known that slept well on their first night in this house." Beatrice and I looked at each other. Whatever could she mean? There was silence for a moment, and then Beatrice looked up and asked, "Do lots of children come here, then?" "Only a few lucky ones," said Mademoiselle Gamay with a smile. "But surely you know why you are here." "We were supposed to meet our parents, but they couldn't come, so they sent us to stay with Dr. Drake," said Beatrice. "Did you visit Dr. Drake's shop?" asked Mademoiselle Gamay. "Yes," answered Beatrice. "Did you see downstairs?" "Yeah," I began. "No," answered Beatrice. "Not really," I agreed. "Did you meet Emery?" "Yes," said Beatrice. "And you don't know why you're here?" "To learn all about dragon—" I began. "To stay with Dr. Drake," said Beatrice, interrupting me. "Well," said Mademoiselle Gamay, "I won't tell you any more. I don't want to spoil the surprise. Have some more tea, eat your breakfast, and then wait for Dr. Drake in the drawing-room. I am sure that he will explain everything." The drawing-room was small and neat, with a window that faced the front lawn. 3 rabbits were hopping about lazily down at the far end. The only interesting thing in the room was a small bookshelf in the corner, and I went straight over to it. But instead of the fascinating volumes about dragons and wizards and pirates or ancient Egypt that I hoped to find, there was a series of dull-looking tomes about geography, politics, natural history, economic theory, and one particularly uninviting volume entitled "The History of Benzene in the Manufacturing Industries." "Good morning," said Dr. Drake when he arrived. "Mademoiselle Gamay tells me you hardly got a wink of sleep last night. Well, well, I am sorry, but I am not surprised. Now, as I have told you, something important has come up, and I will be very busy. But it will not be long before the other children arrive, and our summer school begins." "Summer school?" said Beatrice. She sounded as though it was almost too good to be true. If only she knew what real learning was like, I thought. "Yes," said Dr. Drake, smiling. "That is one of the reasons your parents sent you to me." "But what will we learn?" I asked. "What would you like to learn?" he said. "About dragon—" I began, but Beatrice interrupted me again. "About science, and literature, and art, and languages, and chemistry, and mathematics," she said. "Excellent!" said Dr. Drake. "Then it looks as though we'll have our work cut out for us. But I'm afraid school does not start for another week. Until then, you must sometimes amuse yourselves, without looking into any places that you shouldn't," he added, looking at me. "Of course not," I said. "Today," continued Dr. Drake, "I must walk into the forest to collect various plants and other things that I need. Beatrice, I would be delighted if you would accompany me. I think that you will enjoy learning about some of the beautiful flora and fauna we have out here in the countryside. Daniel, I rather fear that I will not invite you along on our little expedition. You shall stay here. I do not think we need to discuss the reason why." I knew very well why. It was a punishment for my keyhole spying the day before. I nodded glumly and looked out the window. There were suddenly only 2 rabbits on the lawn. "Very good," said Dr. Drake. "Then I advise you to spend the day broadening your education. I think you know enough Latin verbs to get started with. There are plenty of books here, as you can see, which should suffice to entertain you. But you must remember not to go looking into rooms and places that do not concern you. Mademoiselle Gamay will come back to the house at around 12:30 to give you some lunch." And without further ado, Dr. Drake collected a large leather bag and stick from the hall, opened the front door, and set off with long strides down a path that led off from the main driveway towards the forest, accompanied by my sister, who, to my surprise, followed him without a word. Chapter 6. On the Origin of Species. When Beatrice and Dr. Drake had gone, I decided that I might as well try to find a book to read. I loved natural history. The animals, birds, and fishes of the world have always fascinated me. And when I saw a volume by a man I had heard of, Charles Darwin, I thought I might as well give it a try. So I picked it up, opened it, and began to read. When on board the HMS Beagle as a naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the inhabitants of South America, and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. It was not the easiest of books, but I found that it did get a little more straightforward after a while, and I did manage to get some idea of what Darwin was writing about. But what really interested me I found on the 5th or 6th page. At the bottom were 3 perfect sketches of dragons' heads. At least the one on the right looked like a proper dragon's head. The one on the left looked more like it had come from a dinosaur, while the middle one seemed to be something in between. And under the picture was a handwritten note that said, "As the dragon's head evolved, so did the fangs and venom-producing organs responsible for the remarkable phenomenon of fire-breathing." At that I began to flick through the book, finding several sketches of dragons that seemed to be illustrating points that Darwin was making. There was a series of claw sketches, and a sketch showing what it called wing development. Another set of sketches seemed to show how a baby dragon developed in its egg, and a later sketch showed a duck-billed platypus with the caption, "Some believed that the original specimen was a stitched-together fake." I decided that when I grew up, I didn't just want to be any old explorer, but a dragon explorer. Soon I was imagining going to India to trek through the jungle to search for for dragons in lost caves. When it was time for lunch, Mademoiselle Gamay called me into the kitchen, where we ate fish soup and slices of thick, chunky bread. It was about 6 o'clock when Dr. Drake and Beatrice returned. I was glad to see them, for I had actually started to get rather lonely, but my gladness soon turned to jealousy when I saw that Beatrice, although she must have spent the entire day walking, was smiling broadly and chattering animatedly to Dr. Drake. "Good afternoon, Daniel," called Dr. Drake, grinning at me. "And how have you spent the day?" I showed him the book I had been reading. "An excellent choice," he enthused. "Did you find it interesting?" "I thought it was a bit difficult, but there were some interesting drawings in it," I said. "You liked the drawings?" said Dr. Drake, smiling. "You are getting on well, I see. I shall test you on the chapters you have read after dinner, and we'll see if you have finished by the end of the week." My heart sank. If I had to finish that great long book, there was no way I was going out. When he had left the room, Beatrice turned to me and said, "Cheer up, Daniel. You know Dr. Drake isn't as bad as—" "Hang Dr. Drake!" I shouted. "And hang you too!" And I stomped out into the garden to look at the rabbits. My mood didn't improve during the whole 3 days that it took me to struggle through On the Origin of Species. But on the 4th day, an ox cart arrived with Emery, another man, and a boy in it. On the back of the cart was what seemed to be a large crate covered in a large black tarpaulin. "Hey, Daniel," said Emery when he saw me, "is Dr. Drake at home?" "He went to Horsham with my sister," I said. "What about Dominique?" asked Emery, climbing down from the cart. "Do you mean Mademoiselle Gamay?" I said. "She's gone out too. They left me behind, as usual." He nodded and then whistled. "Well, that sure is a shame. Ooh, by the way," he said, gesturing toward his companions, "this is Mr. Flight, and this is Darcy Kemp." Mr. Flight, who was much older than Emery and had a bald head, nodded, while Darcy Kemp, who wore large spectacles and was dressed in clothes that were ever so slightly tatty, with a cap and necktie done up in a knot round his throat, came over and shook me warmly by the hand. "Delighted," he said. "You're here for the school?" I nodded. "We're early," said Darcy.
"Better early than late," said Mr. Flight, "but better late than never. We shall just have to leave our cargo in the coal shed."
"You'll tell him his delivery has arrived, won't you, Daniel?" said Emery. "If he comes back before Darcy has an errand to run." I nodded. And then I watched the 3 of them as they lifted the heavy crate off the ox cart with some difficulty. Being careful not to let the tarpaulin slip, they took it over to one of the large outbuildings that seemed to have been used as a coal shed. Emery took out a key and unlocked it, and they pulled the crate inside. When he came out, Emery said, "Now, Daniel, there is no need for a young fellow like you to go snooping around in there. But I know what young fellows are like." And with a broad smile he locked the door again and pocketed the key. And with that the two men got back onto the ox cart, turned it around, and set off down the drive towards the main road. Darcy winked at me and set off in exactly the opposite direction, towards the forest. "See you later," he said. When I was sure that all had gone, I went back into the house and shut the door. I took up my book and started to read it, but I couldn't concentrate. I just had to find out what was in that crate. I knew there was a little window around the back of the shed, with a broken latch because I had managed to climb through it a couple days before. Inside it had been empty apart from a few old sacks, some coal, and 3 wooden beams stacked against the wall. So I went out to the shed and, trying my best not to get my clothes dirty, climbed in and went over to look at the crate. I lifted the tarpaulin that covered it, and a deafening screech sounded, making me stumble backwards towards the window. From inside the crate was a creature that could only be described as a baby dragon. The same one that had tried to attack me in London. It was clawing at the bars of the cage, shaking it, and rocking it backwards and forwards most worryingly, beating its wings and looking at me so piercingly that I could not take my gaze from it even for a moment. I felt just as a frog must feel when it is being hypnotized by a snake. I couldn't move a muscle. All I could do was gaze into the creature's eyes as a wisp of smoke curled from its nostrils.
And that is where we are going to leave off today, guys. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to tune in tomorrow as we continue the story of The Dragon's Eye from the Dragonology Chronicles. Don't forget to come in for our new grab-and-go craft bags at each of the 3 buildings this week. Also, don't forget to tune in for our other live programs, Toddler Time with Miss Becky, Stories with Sunny, and Creating with Constance. The libraries are open, but you can still get curbside service if you prefer. And don't forget, you still have access to digital content through our digital content services at sweetwaterlibraries.com. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. We'll see you tomorrow.